Friends, welcome back. Today I will be discussing on a sensation which is very interesting. Interesting in the sense this has been nomenclatured as a crude touch, and it continues, but lately this crude touch is no more crude. Now this crude touch is especially a touch associated with emotion or affective touch or a sensual touch. Now we look into this in the current discussion. I have just given one picture here showing the two friends and their feelings. You can all imagine, you can try to predict what they are feeling about. The crude touch and pressure are the sensations carried by the anterolateral column in the spinal cord. In the spinal cord, we have the posterior column and the lateral column and the anterior column. So these are ascending as anterolateral column. This anterolateral column carries sensations: crude touch, crude pressure, pain, thermal sensation, tickle, itch, and also the sexual sensations from the contralateral side of the body. The anterolateral column sensation or anterolateral column receives or forms two tracts. One tract ventrally placed, one tract laterally placed. The one which is ventrally placed is known as the anterior spinothalamic tract, and one which is placed in the lateral side is the lateral spinothalamic tract. The anterior or ventral spinothalamic tract transmits crude touch, deep pressure, tickle, and sexual sensation, whereas lateral spinothalamic tract transmits pain. Again, in pain there are two different components which I will be dealing with that when I take up the pain, and thermal sensation in some part of each. As we know, there are two modalities of touch. The one is a precise or a discriminative touch. This is also known as a epicritic touch. Epicritic touch, so that means it could be discriminated. So this epicritic touch or a discriminative touch is carried by the posterior column, we have seen, and it provides information about the facts about the touch sensation. That means the location, the movement, the strength, and other attributes of touch, all other attributes of touch which is carried by the posterior column. There is another touch modality which is a non-discriminative. This is known as a crude touch, sensual touch, or affective touch. This touch is poorly localized, vague, blurred, transmitted slowly as compared to the discriminative touch, and it is associated with the emotions. It is carried by the anterior spinothalamic tract. The emotional aspects of sensation include calming of a baby by the touch of a mother, reassuring hug from a friend, or a supportive pat from a father, and many more such modalities of touch you have seen. You can imagine about that. What are the receptors and fibers carrying the crude touch and pressure sensations? The crude touch is by the free nerve endings located in the deeper structures, that is in the dermis or below, or even in the fascia, from tactile and also from tactile corpuscles, and from the receptors around the hair follicles. This is carried by the unmyelinated C fibers. These are from the mechanosensors, and they are low threshold fibers. They are carried by the dorsal root ganglion to the posterior horn, relayed in lamina 1 to 4 of the dorsal horn. You see that the lamina there on the other side. You can just see the mechanoreceptors are giving in 1, 2, 3, 4, and even 5. Fifth lamina also it is given. Some of the books mention that they relay even in the 6, 7, 8 laminae of the spinal cord. The crude pressure, on the other hand, is originating from the tactile corpuscles. Pacinian corpuscles are one of them. They are from the thinly myelinated A beta and A delta fibers, mostly A delta fibers, that is conduction velocity somewhere around 15 to 20 meters per sec. Again, they relay in the posterior horn in the same laminae. On the left hand side, you see that they are relayed there. Then after relaying in the respective neurons of the layer 1 to 5, then they cross to the opposite side. The axons of the second order neurons cross to the opposite side and ascend in the anterior funiculus or anterior side. Hence they are called ventral or anterior spinothalamic tract. And in the medulla they become lateral to the medial lemniscal bundle. They are also traveling with the spinotectal tract and lateral spinothalamic tract. They relay in the ventro-posterolateral nucleus of thalamus. This is what the most of the textbooks describe. And the recent literature suggests that the projection of these neurons or projection of these fibers will be on the neurons of the medial lemniscal touch. So that means they may share a common thing which may reach third order neurons from here. That means there is some amount of convergence or collateralism with this, and they would reach the sensory cortex, area 312. But since these touch sensations are vague, not defined, so this is whatever this modality which has been described in many of the textbooks may not satisfy certain of our observations associated with this touch. Anyway, I will come back with that in my next slide. So then after reaching the cortex, you can see this is the homunculus, that is the representation from which part of the body they are originating, and it is represented in the topographical fashion in the sensory homunculus. And you see that hand and the face and the tongue, they have a larger representation, and the remaining parts are having a lesser representation. Since the vagueness of the touch raised a number of interesting issues regarding this touch, because if this were to be localized with a topographical representation like this, so then it should be the posterior column sensations as an adjunct to the posterior column sensations. So what happens if this touch sensation is lost, or there is a spinal cord lesion? If this sensation is lost, so then what happens to the touch? Touch still remains. That means there is a representation in the cortex, but it is vague. However, the emotional components associated to the touch will be missing when this tract is damaged. Considering this aspect, the researches, the recent editions will be giving additional information for the pathway and processing of this touch. Anterior spinothalamic tract carrying the crude touch, as I discussed, and it is debated that it is not giving only to the sensory nucleus in the thalamus, that is the ventro-posterolateral nucleus of the thalamus, which supplies to the sensory parietal cortex. Besides this, it is also relayed, or it also gives information or relay into the posterior ventromedial nucleus of the thalamus. You can just see posterior ventral nucleus of the thalamus on the other right hand side in B. You can see it clearly, ventral posterior medial, that nucleus of the thalamus. And this nucleus gives efferents to the insular cortex. I will discuss about the insular cortex in my subsequent slides. Then it also gives information or relays into the medial dorsal nucleus. This medial dorsal nucleus, which is, you can just see in both the things very well represented. It supplies the limbic cortex, that is cingulate cortex. The posterior ventromedial nucleus supplies to the insular cortex, which becomes a sensory component of the sensory processing of this touch, crude touch. The medial dorsal nucleus of that will be the limbic aspect, the affective behavior of the touch. Thus, we can say that it relays in 3 nuclei in the thalamus. You can just see here on the left hand side, the anterior spinothalamic tract ascends up, gives in thalamus medial dorsal nucleus, one side, MDVC, it is written as MDVC, and ventromedial posterior, VMPO. From the ventromedial posterior, it is given to the introspective cortex. That introspective cortex is the insular cortex. And also area 3A, that becomes the sensory cortex. That is sensory cortex. Then from the medial dorsal nucleus, it gives to anterior cingulate gyrus. These areas, whatever the areas it is supplying, that means the efferents from ventromedial posterior nucleus and the mediodorsal nucleus, they are supplying to a number of structures: amygdala, hypothalamus, orbital frontal cortex, the prefrontal cortex, the brainstem homeostatic regions, that is the reticular system, and nucleus accumbens, and a number of structures all over the entire cortex. So these will provide sensory and emotional and motivational aspect of the touch from the body. The insular cortical connections, we just see little bit detail. This is taken from the current biology. You can just see the insular cortex and the functions. They have listed the functions of 1 to 12 or 13. I just read: sensory processing, salience detection, that means a known to unknown, the valence assessment. Valence is the degree of the affection in the sense that is the person, whether he is loved or hated or a friend or a foe, something like that. Number 4 is it integrates all sensory modalities. Number 5 is it provides the introspection, thinks about. So then after the introspection, it has the autonomic control. It will try to have the autonomic influences in terms of the changes in the blood pressure, heart rate, or other visceral components. Then we have number 7, it is working with the brain networking, the entire brain networking, and it will also look into the risk assessment, outcome prediction, and once that means it tries to have the judgment or decision making. So these are associated with the emotions. So then in the risk assessment, you can see that anticipations whether to approach or accept an individual or avoid an individual. That type of behavior, that is a flexible behavior, anticipating these things. But I have placed integration, introspection, emotion, socialization, decision making. Socialization, emotion associated with the socialization and decision making becomes important part of the insular connections receiving from the crude touch. Then the information coming from the dorsomedial or medial dorsal nucleus of the thalamus, they give it to the cingulate cortex, that is the forming the limbic cortex. It has a neural networking with the amygdala, lateral prefrontal cortex, parietal cortex, insular cortex also, the motor area, the spinal cord, hippocampus, other limbic regions, also the chordator nucleus. The cingulate cortex connects hub of emotions, the sensation and action. So that means it connects the insular cortex also here, and it takes up all the information and processes it. The pathways involved in motivational processing and together with the other centers, thus it makes the reward centers of the brain. So that means with the nucleus accumbens and this component together, they become a reward center. Once that means a particular touch, whether it is rewarding or not. Now I come back here. I mentioned an example. A child, the infant usually cries, and when the infant cries and somebody else, stranger touches, and it will increase the crying at a higher level. So that means it will not stop. The moment the mother touches, it calms down. It becomes cool. Okay, now you can associate all those emotional reactions of the infant, because now that touch is developed well. So it is not the precision here, and this is the crude touch that is making the miracle. The cingulate cortex projects pathways to the lateral prefrontal cortex and involved in the executive control of the sensory modality, the working memory associated with the crude touch, and the learning. What is the working memory associated with the touch, whatever the type of touch, the modality of touch. So here there is no discrimination. There is no discrimination on the spot. The discrimination is done by the posterior column sensation. Now you look back, the same thing I have mentioned here, the connections, the somatosensory area, amygdala, prefrontal area, motor cortex, caudate nucleus, hippocampus, nucleus accumbens, hypothalamus, reticular system, so many areas. On this side you have that graph, this figure showing that blue component extended will becomes the entire cingulate cortex. The blue one is the cortico-limbic system or the anterior cortex. So this will be associated with the connection with the prefrontal cortex. You can just see the frontal lobe and this thing. And you have the orange one is the amygdala. So then you have the dentate gyrus and the hippocampus situated there. So that means the cingulate cortex is associated with the attention, social interaction, the motivation, emotional stress and learning. Here amygdala is involved. Amygdala gives impulses to the hypothalamus, whether it is the child has to cry further or child has to stop crying. So that is an effective response. So then emotional, that is amygdala will give it to hypothalamus, and then it may control, or amygdala will give to the motor cortex that will stop, whatever. Then the similar type of touch is stored in the hippocampus for learning and subsequent memory. So this is about the cingulate cortex. What are the clinical significance of crude touch or sensual touch? In lesions of the anterior spinothalamic tract, neurologically, crude touch still persists as a part of the sensation carried by the posterior column. How do you test it? We test it by some blunt object touching and trying to ask them to identify whether he feels or not feels. So that is the test we perform. But that is not the real aspect of what we are discussing. However, that means that aspect persists in the lesions of the spinothalamic tract. But the emotional aspects associated with the touch is lost. Say for example, for assumption purposes, a child is not having that anterior spinothalamic tract. So then the soothing effect does not work. So that means emotional component is lost. Another important thing, studies have been done in parents who have not given the skin contact, usually because in some of the studies in USA where the child was not given to the mother for some days for some or the other reason, and such children, when they develop later year, have a greater tendency to exhibit psychosocial abnormalities, even up to the schizophrenia. So that means this contact, parental skin contact, will have some social interactions and the child develops normally. This is the significance of this crude touch. Summary of the crude or affective touch or sensual touch. Known as an emotional touch. For example, hug from a friend or a touch you got as a child from your mother. It is a non-discriminative form of a touch mediated by special sensors called C tactile fibers, that means free nerve endings with a C nerve fibers, conveys information slowly. It is vague because in terms of where is being touched is not known, relayed in the dorsal horn neurons in the spinal cord and cross opposite side to the anterior spinothalamic tract, relay in VPL, VMPO, that is the ventromedial posterior nucleus of thalamus, then mediodorsal nucleus of the thalamus or dorsomedial nucleus of thalamus. Thalamic projections reach sensory area 312, insular cortex, that is for introspection, integration, emotion and socialization, and cingulate cortex, emotions and their responses, also memory and learning and motivation. It sends information to the limbic system and posterior insula that is crucial for social bonding of the touch. Friends, regarding the sexual touch, not much is known, and I do not know what are the various pathways or these things, but it is placed in the anterior spinothalamic tract. In the next lecture, I would be dealing with the physiology of thermal sensations. I will come back with the physiology of thermal sensation. Till that time, try to answer some of the questions for your own evaluation. Thank you very much.